In the world of the Le Mans, regardless of whatever year or particular generation or era that you pick from, it's always a very, very highly competitive sphere of racing. In fact, one of the most competitive, you could say, and for good reason. It's one of the ultimate tiers, the ultimate classes of racing in the entire racing calendar, and it pretty much has always been since its inception. Now, back in the day, you would much more often see cars that tried radically different ideas than you do now. Now it tends to be about the smaller details, where certain teams will squeeze that little bit more efficiency out of a car than, say, their opposition will, but the rules are very, very narrow, very tight in terms of the engine size, the power, the kind of aero shape. So it really is down to those details more than ever before, as well as, of course, a plan for the race, pit stops, all that kind of stuff. Now, back in the day, of course, they still had rules. There were engine sizes, different classes, etc. But you would often see these more radical departures from the norms, such as with cars like the Cadillac Il Mostro, for instance, or a number of others which were completely different to anything else on the grid. And even in more recent times, you will occasionally see something like that now. The Nissan Nismo, for instance, the GTR LM car. Now, this is a perfect example of one such occasion. It's a car which is tiny, physically speaking. It's also tiny in terms of how often it's talked about. And of course, by definition, that means that it deserves a place here. Now, the car in question is called the LM64, and it's produced by Panhard. Now, the car itself is based on the production spec Panhard CD, which itself also was used for racing in the early 60s. But this car is kind of like the top-tier evolution of the concept, if you will, because this Panhard CD LM64 is the peak, really, of aerodynamic design as far as Panhard goes. Now, the production car is already a very, very aerodynamic machine, and if you've never seen that one, it's worth Googling. It looks kind of like a combination of a Renault Alpine and an Alfa Romeo Giulietta from the 60s, especially from the back. It's a pretty good-looking little car. It has a relatively small two-stroke boxer engine, minimal amount of power. The performance isn't incredible, but it's a nice little classic. This car, on the other hand, looks quite a lot more extreme. Now, it's ultra low, it's extremely aerodynamic looking, and of course, the most distinctive thing about its design is, of course, the two huge wings sticking straight up out of the back of the car in some kind of weird amalgamation of a modern LMP machine's fin combined with something like a 59 Cadillac Buritz's fins on the trunk put together. Now, of course, those are for aerodynamic reasons. They're to keep the car stable. But the great thing about the LM64 is that this is a car which, in a similar way to some others, really places all of its eggs in the basket of aerodynamic efficiency. Because even back then, Panhard knew that they were not going to win the race outright. They weren't trying to do that. What they were trying for was twofold. They were trying for a class victory in terms of engine size and to be the most efficient car in the race. Now, the engine itself is still around an 850cc, again, two-cylinder, boxer engine, and it doesn't put out much power. Even in this very heavily tuned and even supercharged form, you're still only looking at just under 80 horsepower. It's about 78 to be exact. So by today's standards, you literally wouldn't even get on the grid as a pace car, let alone an actual racing machine. And even back then, that was a tiny amount of power. Now, the hitch with that was they wouldn't be allowed to compete because the engine, being smaller than 1 litre or 1000cc, was not eligible. However, and this happened much more back in the day, of course, and it even happened with stuff like the Howmet TX's turbine engine, they will sometimes categorize a car as being larger in capacity than it actually is based on aspiration modifications, such as with a turbo or a supercharger, or sometimes based on its rough power and torque figures. That's what happened with the Howmet. It similarly happened to some degree with the Mazda 787B, and it happened here as well, because the engine itself would not have been allowed, but because they supercharged it, they allowed it to run in the equivalent of the 1200cc category. And that's pretty cool, because it allowed this car with some seeming disadvantages, but some truly incredible advantages to its name, to actually compete. So what was so good about this car, and why am I featuring it? Well, the best thing by far is that Aero Design. It's such an aerodynamically efficient car, it's actually to this day, one of the most aerodynamic cars ever made. And I'm not just talking race cars, I'm talking race cars, road cars, even land speed record cars. Now, to give you some idea of just how efficient this car was, way back in 1964, this car's drag coefficient is 0.12. Now, in a vacuum, that doesn't sound like it means very much, but to put that into perspective, the 2006 world record holding diesel land speed record car from JCB has a drag coefficient of 0.15. So this is literally more aerodynamically efficient than the land speed record car that set the diesel record of around, I believe it was 320 miles per hour, something like that. Now, this car, of course, isn't quite that quick. No car is aerodynamic enough to make 80 horsepower stretch quite that far, but what it can do is still excellent. Now, the car only weighs 560 kilos, so it's super small, super lightweight, super aerodynamic, and the top speed is actually really good. This thing actually hit 137 miles per hour in the Le Mans. It actually competed in the race. In fact, two of them did, the LM64-1 and the LM64-2. Now, unfortunately, and this is often the case with the race cars that we talk about here, no matter how good a car is, even in modern times, things can just happen. Things can go wrong. Toyota, for instance, having a tyre blowout with the GT1, various other well-known things and not so well-known things where a car might have even been winning the race and ended up just losing for various unforeseen reasons. That, unfortunately, happened to both of the LM64s. One of them had to retire due to transmission trouble and the second due to engine trouble, and that's a shame, because although the car was nowhere near the absolute fastest on the grid, it did qualify in testing at the Le Mans in 33rd place on the grid, which doesn't sound amazing, and in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to worry most of the other cars there. But as I said, it wasn't the only goal to just win in class, but also to be the most efficient. And had it finished the race, even if it hadn't have won in class, it probably would have won in that category of being so efficient. In terms of aero design, in terms of fuel usage, it's an outstanding and definitely undervalued car. It's certainly worthy of a place in this series. It's the definition of an unsung hero, because it's a car which wasn't just oddball or weird or wacky for the sake of it. It was for a very specific reason. And some of the things on this car were actually so good, even in 1964, that to this day, they still sound impressive. 137 miles per hour from a car with only 80 horsepower is still remarkable, and this car even featured a completely sealed underbody to give it, in effect, ground effect downforce, like a diffuser would have in much more use later on. So this is a car most definitely ahead of its time. It's an unsung hero, for sure, and it happens to be pretty cool looking at the same time. I was fortunate enough to see one at the Goodwood Festival of Speed a few years ago, and it's quite a lot louder than you'd expect for a car with this size engine, and it's a sight to behold. It's an incredible looking machine, and it's a shame that it never had its full chance to shine, due to mechanical issues which really can happen to anyone. So it's a shame, but it's certainly worth talking about more. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, if you want to check out tons of other cool cars in this series, you can click through to see those at the end. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.